After the Second World War, the British Royal Navy faced a problem that at first sounded almost absurd. Jet aircraft were faster, heavier, and far more demanding than anything that had flown from aircraft carriers before. Traditional deck landings, even with arrestor wires, remained dangerous, unpredictable, and costly in both machines and lives. British engineers began asking an unusual question. What if naval aircraft could land without landing gear at all? The idea was not born from eccentricity, but from cold calculations. Jet engines made propellers obsolete, and jets did not require wheels to slow themselves down on land. Removing the landing gear would significantly reduce aircraft weight, free internal space for fuel or weapons, and simplify the airframe. In theory, a lighter aircraft could fly farther, faster, and take off more easily from a carrier catapult. The only problem was the landing itself. Throughout the late 1940s, Britain experimented with several radical concepts. Engineers considered floating runways, soft soil strips, sand beds, and even detachable landing trolleys. But the most unconventional solution came from British engineer Lewis Boddington, who proposed something that sounded almost unreal: landing aircraft on rubber. The concept was deceptively simple. Instead of a rigid steel deck, an aircraft carrier would be fitted with a large rubber surface laid over multiple layers of pressurized fire hoses. This rubber deck would act like a giant shock absorber, dispersing the impact of a landing aircraft across a flexible surface. The deck would be constantly sprayed with water to reduce friction and prevent damage to both aircraft and rubber. British calculations suggested that a rubber mat approximately 45 meters long and 12 meters wide could safely absorb the landing of a jet aircraft, weighing up to 3.5 tons. To test this idea, the Royal Navy turned to one man who seemed almost destined for dangerous experiments: Winkle Brown. By that time, Brown was already legendary, a test pilot who had flown more aircraft types than any human in history, including captured German jets. On December 29, 1947, Brown climbed into a modified de Havilland Sea Vampire jet, stripped of its landing gear, and prepared for the first real rubber deck landing. The first attempt was anything but graceful. The aircraft touched down at excessive speed, slammed into the rubber surface, and bounced violently. The impact was brutal, but the deck held. Brown walked away shaken but unharmed, and the aircraft remained largely intact. For an experiment that many believed would end in disaster, this alone was considered a success. By the spring of 1948, both the aircraft and the rubber deck were refined. The hoses beneath the rubber were adjusted for better pressure distribution, and the Sea Vampire was further optimized. This time, Brown performed a near-perfect landing. The jet settled onto the rubber surface smoothly, decelerated rapidly, and came to rest without arrestor wires or wheels. For the Royal Navy, it was a breakthrough moment. Encouraged by the results, the British installed a rubber deck aboard the aircraft carrier HMS Warrior. Special deck cranes were added to move aircraft, since planes without landing gear could not taxi on their own. Over the following months, more than 200 successful landings were conducted, both at sea and on shore-based test platforms. Even the United States Navy took interest and sent its own test pilot to observe and participate in the trials. Technically, the concept worked. Aircraft could land safely on rubber. Pilots could adapt to the technique. Damage rates were low, and the landings proved repeatable. Yet as testing continued, the limitations became increasingly obvious. Aircraft without landing gear could operate only from carriers equipped with rubber decks, drastically reducing operational flexibility. Preparing an aircraft for launch required additional equipment and more time. Deck operations became slower and more complex. Most importantly, landing on rubber demanded exceptional pilot skill, leaving little margin for error in combat conditions. There was also a deeper realization. Jet aircraft were evolving rapidly. Each new generation became heavier, faster, and more complex. The weight savings gained by removing landing gear would soon be negligible compared to overall aircraft mass. The rubber deck, once seen as a revolutionary solution, began to look like a temporary workaround for a problem that technology itself was already solving. Britain even went so far as to design a dedicated fighter, the Supermarine Type 505, specifically intended for rubber deck operations. But before it could leave the drawing board, it was converted into a conventional aircraft with standard landing gear. The verdict was clear. By the early 1950s, the Royal Navy officially abandoned the rubber deck concept. Advances in arrestor systems, angled flight decks, and stronger landing gear made traditional carrier operations safer and more practical. The rubber deck was quietly classified as a technological dead end. Yet this strange experiment remains a fascinating example of post-war innovation. It was a moment when engineers dared to challenge the most basic assumptions of aviation, when necessity encouraged radical thinking, and when one test pilot trusted a sheet of rubber beneath him more than steel. The British did not land aircraft on rubber because it was sensible. They did it because, for a brief moment, it seemed like the future.